The purpose of this training video is to explain how to stick plant cuttings into trays. It is designed for new employees. After finishing this video, you will know how to stick cuttings into trays efficiently and with care, which will consistently result in high-quality trays of plants. You will be able to identify damaged cuttings and cuttings that are not uniform. You will know how to handle the cuttings and place them in the tray. By now you should have received training from Video 1 and from your supervisor on preparing your workstation and matching bags with trays. You are now ready to inspect the cuttings and stick them into the tray. The moisture level in the tray. The substrate should be moderately wet when the cuttings are stuck. If the substrate is too dry, the cuttings quickly lose water and die. Dry substrate looks light brown and the tray will be very light in weight. If the substrate is too wet, the cuttings may rot. Very wet substrate looks dark and shiny on the surface and may drip water from beneath the tray. When you receive a tray, check that the substrate is dark brown, feels moist, and doesn't drip from the bottom. If the tray is too dry or wet, tell the supervisor so they can adjust the watering. What is dibbling? Dibbling is the action of creating holes for the cuttings in the substrate surface before sticking. Typically, each tray cell gets one dibbled hole. The purpose of dibbling is to make it easier to stick the cutting into the substrate without damaging the stem, and to center the cutting in the cell. Some cuttings with strong stems are easily pressed into the substrate and do not need a dibble. You may be required to dibble holes in your tray using a tool, or the tray may come to you pre-dibbled. Size of the dibble hole. The width of the dibble should be only slightly wider than the stem. If the hole is too wide, the cutting will fall over and the hole will collect water. If the hole is too deep, the cutting base won't have good contact with the substrate and it may be difficult to keep the cuttings hydrated. If the dibble is too narrow, it is easy to break stems during sticking. The better the cutting fits into the dibble hole, the better it will root and grow. Ask your supervisor about dibble sizes. Check the quality of the cuttings. Before you place cuttings in the tray, check that they do not have damage from diseases or other causes. Here are some examples of healthy and damaged cuttings. Here are some healthy cuttings. Notice they are green, have no spots or insects, and are not wilted. Here are some damaged cuttings that look diseased, in this case turning brown after being too long in the shipping box. Report any problems with cutting quality to your supervisor immediately. The supervisor and you will decide whether the cuttings are healthy enough to stick. Otherwise, the greenhouse may have to order new cuttings. If diseased cuttings are stuck, then they will probably die and the trays will have to be fixed later on, which is very expensive and a lot of work. Grading the cuttings. Cuttings in each batch should have uniform length, leaf size, and number of leaves. If you see that some cuttings are larger and have more leaves than others, you may need to sort the cuttings so that cuttings of a similar size are placed in each tray. This is called grading and is necessary for the entire tray to grow at the same speed. Here is the result of a good grading job, where all plants have rooted and grown evenly. Here's the result of a poor grading job, where plants did not grow evenly and will cost the company money. Ask your supervisor about grading cuttings. Top and bottom of cuttings. The cutting will have leaves at the top end and a bottom end that has a cut or rooted stem. It is important that the bottom end is stuck into the substrate because only the bottom will produce roots, whereas the top of the plant needs air and light. Handling the cuttings. Remove enough cuttings from the bag to fill a tray. Your supervisor will tell you whether to place the cuttings from the bag directly onto the tray or place them in the workspace beside the tray. When handling the cuttings, be careful not to crush the plants or bend or break the stems when pushed into the substrate. Carefully handle cuttings from the top. Damaged cuttings will die, costing the company a lot of money. If cuttings are dropped on the floor, do not plant them without asking the supervisor, because they may become diseased. It may be necessary to clean dead leaves and damaged tissue from the cutting before sticking to prevent the spread of disease. Sometimes leaves must be removed from the cuttings so that plants can better fit into the dibbled holes. Talk to your supervisor before cleaning or removing leaves for specific instructions. Rooting hormones. You may be required to dip the bottom part of the cutting into a rooting hormone powder or solution. This hormone is a natural product that helps the cutting grow roots quickly. The supervisor will tell you how often to replace the hormone. For example, it may be necessary to use only one batch for each variety to avoid risk of spreading disease. Your supervisor will also tell you if any protective gloves or clothing are needed. Sticking cuttings. Carefully hold cuttings from their top and gently place them into holes or substrate in the center of the cell. Cuttings have to be planted at the right depth to root properly. Cuttings planted too deep will rot, and cuttings planted too shallow will fall out and have to be stuck again. Different plant cuttings require different size holes. For example, a geranium cutting with a large, thick stem needs a wider and deeper hole than a petunia, which has a thinner and shorter stem. Some employees hold multiple cuttings in one hand and stick with the other hand. Some employees place the cuttings on the tray or work area and pick them up one at a time. Other employees use both hands to stick. Your supervisor and experienced coworkers will show you their technique to follow. There may be flexibility in how exactly you handle the cuttings, so long as it is rapid and careful. Number of cuttings per cell. Usually you will stick one into each cell, but sometimes the supervisor will tell you to stick 2 or more cuttings into the same cell. When 2 cuttings are planted in one cell, make sure that the tops of the cuttings are even in height. Sticking speed and cost per tray. The sticking cost per tray is affected by how many trays you stick per hour and also what proportion of the cuttings are correctly stuck into the tray and will therefore survive. If you stick a lot of trays quickly, but the cuttings die or plants need to be replaced, you will not be performing well. If you stick trays carefully but too slowly, that also increases cost. Your supervisor will provide a guideline on the target number of trays stuck per hour. Closing the dibble hole around the stem. After sticking, the base of the cutting needs to have good contact with the substrate around it in order to quickly grow roots. If the dibble hole leaves space around the cutting, it may be necessary to push the substrate gently down around the base of the cutting as seen here. Ask your supervisor if this is necessary for your cuttings. After finishing a tray. Once you have finished sticking all the cuttings in your bag or for your tray, it is time to get the plants ready for the greenhouse. Since the cuttings can lose water during the sticking process, they have to be misted before entering the greenhouse so that they stay hydrated. Sometimes an automated conveyor passes trays under a mist line, or an employee manually mists the leaves. Mist the cuttings using a very fine droplet size and light pressure so that the plants are not washed out of the cells. Carefully place the trays on the conveyor or cart without the cuttings dropping out of the tray, so that they can be taken out to the greenhouse.